I am going to be describing to you as best I can what the situation is with the United States' economic system, which has a name. It's called capitalism. It is a system in very deep doo-doo. It is in the greatest difficulty that I have ever seen in my life, and you can tell from my white hair that I've been around a while. I never expected to see what I am experiencing, and I imagine for many of you it is the same, unless you are committed to something my psychotherapist wife explains to me as the problem of denial. Not a river in Egypt, but an inability to confront what it is that's going on, because it's frightening.
Richard Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus, University of Massachusetts, and he's issued probably one of the most strong warnings that I've heard on what's gonna happen to America. To understand why he believes that the leading superpower is on the verge of collapse, we need to delve through history.
I think that the history of the world is a sequence of empires. The Greek, the Roman, the Persian, the Egyptian, the Chinese, I could go on. And they all have something in common. They are born usually out of the demise of another empire. They evolve and change over a period of time, running from a few decades to a few centuries, and then they die. They pass away.
The current empire that dominates the world is of course the American Empire, but the previous superpower came from this little nation here. Our good old chums, the British. This tiny nation, lovers of tea and football, was once a very different country to what we know it as today. From the 16th century to the end of the 19th century, they were more powerful than America is in the modern era. They had these things called colonies spread throughout the world. A colony being an area that is owned by Britain that has to submit to the British authority. And the British did not just have 1 or 2 colonies under their control, they had 58 spread across the world in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. Countries like India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and even a little country known as America, or back then British America, was once a colony of Britain. At this point in time, if you said that this great superpower would crumble and that a scattered array of colonies would unite together to form its own superpower, people would have said you're crazy. But we all know what happened.
A part of that empire broke away. And in an important lesson, the empire denied that this was building, even though it was building across the entirety of the 18th century. And then in 1776, the denial blew up in its face as the colonists here in this part of the British Empire wanted its independence. And a war was fought, which, to the surprise and chagrin of the British Empire and George III sitting on his throne in England, the British lost.
And out of this loss emerged what we all know today as the United States of America. A new superpower was in control, and the dawn of capitalism had begun. From 1870 to 1970, America grew like a runaway train. Railroads were built across the country so that goods could be transported at breakneck speeds. The automobile was produced en masse so that even the general citizen could afford it. Retail chains were popping up everywhere, and everyone from the worker to the business owner were benefiting.
For that century, roughly 1870s to the 1970s, every decade, real wages of workers were higher than the decade before, even across the Great Depression. So you had this bizarre situation, quite rare in the world, of a capitalism that was able to give rising profits to its capitalists and rising wages to the mass of its workers.
But things were about to change. This date, 1970, is an important one because this is where Wolff sees the problem start to creep in.
And they then really ran with that ball and began to imagine that this exceptionality was somehow inherent, and so it would last forever. It became, and I use this word carefully, crazy.
What's changed in 1970? Pause the video and see if you can think of it. Remember our parents? Remember our grandparents? Back in 1970, the median price for a house was $23,000. The median household income was $9,000. A decent house could be affordable to almost anyone and paid off in a reasonably short period of time. Not only this, but you could support a big family on one income. The wife did not have to work because the husband's income was enough and she could stay at home and take care of the kids. And it's not like the single income was taking care of just 1 or 2 kids. The families were large back then, with families often having 4, 5, or 6 kids. So Richard, what changed in 1970?
As I've told you, real wages went up for a century. 1870s, 1970. Why 1970 do I pick that? Now I can tell you, because that's when real wages in America stopped rising. Absolutely epoch-making change. The average American worker earns now what he or she did in 1978. Try to wrap your head around no more real wage increase. For a country that had enjoyed steady real wage rises for a century, this is a traumatic event.
The real wage that he's talking about is the amount of money that an individual earns after adjusting for inflation, aka the money earned after adjusting for the increase in prices over time. We all know that as time has gone on, wages have increased. In 1970, the average hourly rate was $3.30, and today that number is $30. This is what we call the nominal amount of increase. But what's important is not the nominal increase, but the real increase. If your salary has gone up, but what you can buy is less things with that increase in salary, has your real salary actually increased? The answer is no. From 1970 to 2019, the real salary, the salary we actually have after you adjust for the increase in prices, has stayed the same. This is something that very few people are talking about.
How was it handled in the United States? Denial. There was no discussion at the time or since. No debate in this country. What do we do about all of this?
And post 1970, this has led to some interesting changes. The first is the introduction of women to the workplace. Remember hearing of the days when it was just the man working and they'd come home to a warm welcome, a home-cooked meal, a tidy house? As we all know, those days are gone.
Number one, the women of the United States left the home and had to go out and do wage labor en masse. Now suddenly, all women, all the wives and mothers had to go out. There was no other way to sustain the fantasy of growth. The empire's foundation is beginning to crack.
Second key thing, we started accumulating these cards in our pockets. No, not cards with suits on them, not Pokemon cards, but cards that let us borrow, that let us consume. This consumption did not happen with our own hard-earned money, but through the use of debt. An Econtribute report found that in 1970, households had a 40% debt-to-income ratio. At that stage, their income was more than double their debt balance. Today, that number is 100%. So an average household has the same amount of debt as their entire yearly income. As we can see, it was around that 1970 point where the debt started to decouple from the income. The debt shot up and the income trickled up.
In the 1970s, the banks of the United States decided that the consumer, to whom they had never lent money before, they would now lend money to. In other words, the credit card, which until then had been American Express in the hands of rich people and businessmen, would now become socialized. Everybody's wallet would be crammed full of plastic cards. Live off them. And so the American working class, from around the 1970s to the present, accumulated debt. We are a debt-ridden society in the way we never were before. We became pioneers, not in covered wagons going west, but in what we could cram plastic in our wallets.
The types of debts that we accumulated were not just mortgage debt, which you can argue is reasonable. It started with borrowing for a home, but then people decided to borrow for their car. And then they were allowed to borrow using a credit card, so they could buy whatever their hearts desired. Anything at the shops, anything on Amazon could be bought, not with money earned, but with money borrowed. And then, maybe the worst of them all, even to get an education, people had to get into debt. Students today borrow about $60,000 from the federal government to get a degree. According to Investopedia, on average, they take 21 years to pay this back. So for 4 years of education, you need to work for 21 years just to clear the debts that you accumulate.
All the growth of consumption in the last 40 years has been based on women's labor, women's earnings, and debt. So by now, the family is dying, floating in levels of debt it cannot support because the underlying wage didn't go up, just the debts. Over the last 40 years, there has been a radical redistribution of wealth from the bottom and the middle to the top. And the more top you get, the top 10% have done really well. The top 5%, even better. The top 1%, even better than that. And the top 1/10 of 1%, the best of all. And you know that because in our society, we adulate them. I'm talking about Bill Gates or Elon Musk or Warren Buffett or fill in the blank.
This is a controversial point, but he's not actually wrong factually. If we do a quick Google search, you can see that the top 1% of Americans own around 40% of the nation's wealth, while the bottom 90% own about 27%. So 1% of the population own more than 90% of people. In 1965, the average CEO earned about 20 times what the average worker made. Today, that number is closer to 300 times more. We live in the age of the have-yots and the have-nots, and it's hard to argue that.
This system is so committed to inequality that not only did it grow over the last 40 years as wages stopped rising. Of course, where would workers' income go? They couldn't grow. Their wages were flat, but they were becoming more productive all the time. The last 40 years are the computer, the robot, artificial intelligence, all of that. Workers' productivity goes up. Workers' wages are flat. Wages are what the employer gives you. Productivity is what you give the employer. If what the employer gives you is flat and what you give the employer keeps rising, guess what? You have inequality. You're taking all your growing output and giving it to one small class of people.
And this is where it starts to become a little more contentious, because it was the technology that helped make workers more productive. Office workers used to use typewriters and filing cabinets, which takes a lot of time. Today we just use a PC that does the same job in about 1/20th of the period. The farmer used to use a plow and a sickle to harvest crops. Now they drive a harvester. So should the money go to the workers who are using the machines and doing things efficiently, or should it go to the people who helped invent the technology? Elon Musk with the electric car, Jensen Huang with the GPU, Zuckerberg with online communication. Well, you can say what should have happened, but we all know what has happened. This is one reason why I recommend checking out the sponsor of today's video. You need to be an investor, not just a regular worker. I had to check this, double check and triple check the following startling fact. Right now in the US, there are no producing mines of a very critical rare earth metal. A rare earth metal that is vital to America because it's used in military applications. This mineral is currently 100% imported from other countries, including 27% of the supply coming from China. Yes, China, America's #1 competitor. The mineral we're talking about is tungsten. Tungsten is a core material used in armor-piercing shells and bullets. Its density and hardness allow it to penetrate tank armor and reinforce structures effectively. So it's used in advanced composite armors for military vehicles due to its ability to absorb and dissipate kinetic energy. For decades, globalization has blinded politicians, and the Chinese have become the dominators of mining this rare earth metal. This is why there's never been a better time to hold American-based tungsten stocks. American Tungsten could become the first tungsten producer on US soil after decades of no mining, and is the sponsor of today's video, which I believe you must research as soon as you can. They They are advancing a significant North American past-producing mine in a region with minimal environmental and regulatory barriers compared to overseas competitors. The company's flagship asset used to be the 5th largest operational tungsten mine in the USA, and American Tungsten want to get this up and running again. Right now, its market cap is only 27 million, not billion, not trillion, million. All the while, there are no other companies in the United States which have a realistic path to start production, as far as known, faster than American Tungsten can. Think about the potential. 0 operational mines on US soil for material that is so critical to the USA, and China has already made export bans. The company will soon begin discussions to secure key strategic partnerships and non-dilutive financing with the US Department of Defense and the US Department of Energy. The US Department of Energy classifies tungsten as a critical material, recognizing its strategic importance to national security, clean energy, and high-tech industries. This is where the opportunity sits for American Tungsten, so do your homework on the stock. Okay, now I want to see what Richard Wolff concludes will happen because of all of this.
It doesn't take a PhD in economics, although I have that, for you to understand that if the underlying wage doesn't go up, you can't keep accumulating debt, because the time will come, and it's called 2008, and that's why that song is so appropriate, when the credit system exploded. Cracks in the empire.
Wolff sees this as a sign that the system that we know as capitalism will implode from within. He thinks that the USA has simply had its rise and will see its fall, just like every empire before it. And importantly, he hopes that a new system will take place. The New York Times named Richard as America's most prominent Marxist economist. Marxism is the political and economic theory of Karl Marx, which critiques capitalism and ultimately cheers on communism. And let's just say that Marxism doesn't have the greatest history when it comes to real use cases. The Soviet Union, Cuba, Mao's China, anyone? The USA is still the #1 country in the world where people want to immigrate to, and there's a reason for that. Many of the things that Professor Wolff addresses are correct, but the solution that he offers is what we need to be careful of.